Now, to lend a unique perspective on the issue of green finance, we're joined by the president of the World Bank and crucial backer of climate initiatives, Dr. Jim Kim, and MSNBC's primetime host, Chris Hayes, for an exclusive one-on-one interview.
All right. President Kim, let's start with how central you view climate as an issue in your role as head of the World Bank.
You know, Chris, I'm the first president of the World Bank trained in the sciences, and the first thing I did when I came here was just ask really basic questions about where we are in terms of climate change. And what I learned was very shocking to me. What I also learned is that the worst effects of climate change, the increase in intensity and frequency, for example, of extreme weather events, are going to have its greatest impact on the poor. I have been working on projects to improve the lives, access to healthcare, education, well-being of people in the poorest countries for most of my adult life. And what I learned was not only is this bad for the planet, not only is it bad for everybody, but it's going to be especially devastating for the poorest people. We will never achieve our goal of ending extreme poverty unless we tackle climate change.
So explain the connection between those two. Why is it the case that the projections for a warmer planet and more extreme weather are going to hit the poorest people on Earth the hardest?
Well, you know, one of the things that we've seen is that a huge impact of climate change is going to be on the availability of water, on rainfall. And so, for example, in Africa, a area where countries are constantly facing the threat of famine, 40% of the currently arable land will be lost. So if you lose the ability to grow crops in areas that are already suffering from famine, you can do the math. This is not going to be good for food security for Africa. We also know that after disasters, and we know they're going to happen. I visited Tacloban in the Philippines just a few months ago. And what we see is that it is those low-lying areas where people put shacks up, don't have regular housing, where it hits the hardest. Yeah. I was also in Sendai in Japan, and that was a huge disaster. So many people lost their lives. And I have to say, you know, I admire the Japanese people tremendously because they took that disaster and decided, oh my God, this is bad for us, but how much worse is it going to be in places where they don't have buildings that can withstand earthquakes and tsunamis? You know, the thing about Japan in Sendai is you go there, and at first you don't know that anything's happened because all the buildings remain standing. Now, what happens in places like Haiti, what happens in places like the Philippines, is that the very feeble structures just get knocked out. So every time we try to build up in some of these poor areas, if you have extreme weather events, it's going to plunge people from sometimes pretty decent livings back into poverty.
There's also an interesting angle to this that I think is of particular relevance now as the world sort of pays attention to the growing Ebola virus in West Africa, and particularly your background in global public health and partners in health, which is that, you know, we think about tropical diseases, right? We know that certain kinds of diseases flourish in warmer environments, and the band of places in which those diseases might flourish is simply going to increase as the temperature warms, right?
Exactly. You know, the thing, Chris, is that the Ebola crisis, which we're right in the middle of right now, and you know, we're very grateful for President Obama's announcement yesterday, but we have a really narrow window. And what it showed us is that we're not ready, especially for a much more quickly moving epidemic like pandemic flu or bird flu, you know, something similar to the coronavirus that caused SARS. Now, what we also know is that climate change is changing habitats fundamentally, and this particular outbreak of Ebola was a result of an interaction between animals and humans, bats, for example, that carried the virus. And so if you're changing habitats all the time, we actually don't know. The ability to predict where these epidemics are going to break out is going to be much more difficult.
So let's talk about, so we've talked a little bit about the disproportionate effects that the global south, the developing world, will see from a warming planet. Let's talk about the other side, the investment and energy side. One of the things you'll sometimes hear, and I've seen this from people who have responded to things I've written, is you American liberals with your green energy thing, that's basically a kind of first world affectation. People that are in the global south, people that are living on $2 a day, they just need to burn fossil fuel, and this is a kind of luxury. Worrying about this is essentially a luxury. What does the energy profile in the poorest parts of the world look like, and what does it have to look like so that we get on a trajectory to where we can have a sustainable future?
Well, it's a great question, Chris. And so if you start off with just the most basic numbers, over 7 billion people in the world, 1.2 billion still don't have access to electricity, for example. And so if you provided all of those people with electricity using traditional methods, that would only increase the output of carbon into the air by less than 1%. Now, our role, though, is to not increase access to electricity through traditional channels. We're very focused on making renewable energy affordable. Last year we spent $9 billion on energy, and only 1.7% of that $9 billion that we spent on energy went for traditional fossil fuels. We've got to look at every option possible to provide energy to the poor. I've described the situation in Africa as one of energy apartheid. There's only 80 gigawatts of installed capacity in all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is about the same as in Italy. So, we cannot expect that the African countries would be able to, for example, respond to Ebola if they don't have electricity for clinics, if they don't have electricity to drive very fundamental medical equipment that can detect the virus. I mean, you've got to be serious. We've got to be serious about ensuring that all the 1.2 billion people have access to electricity. Now, if we were not creative about it and did it with traditional fossil fuels, it would raise CO2 levels minimally. The really exciting thing is we can both provide access to energy and do it with the renewable sources. Whether we like it or not, we've got to start looking at technologies like hydropower. We've gotten better at being able to put in hydropower facilities. And even though there are many in the world who are against hydropower fundamentally, you've got to look at comparing what it would cost you in terms of climate change to provide the same amount of energy with coal-burning power plants versus putting in hydro. And we're looking at it right now, and frankly, hydro looks pretty good.
That's interesting. So my understanding is that in basically the developed world, every place you could put in hydro has hydro in it, right? There's no more fruit to take off that tree, as it were. There's a lot of opportunity for that in the developing world. What is the kind of debate, discussion, controversy around that?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people who are very concerned about the conservation of nature. There are a lot of people who fundamentally want to protect rivers. And, I admire their work. I think it's great. But the arguments usually are around, well, you're going to destroy habitats, well, you're going to destroy, by flooding lands, you're going to release methane gas. But let's just look at one project. And, this hasn't started yet. The river is one of the greatest potential sources of hydroelectric power in the world. Probably the greatest source. And there is a potential for generating hydroelectric power that would provide 40 gigawatts. Remember, I just told you that all of sub-Saharan Africa has 80. So this would increase the access to electricity by 50% for that country. And if you did the equivalent in coal-powered electricity generation, compared to the hydro, you'd take out billions of tons of carbon dioxide every year by having hydro. Now, here's the issue. If you compare the carbon you take out of the air by preventing coal-powered electricity with the methane and other gases released from flooding lands, at the end of the day, the calculation, there's no comparison. Now, I don't think we're going to convince the people who want to preserve rivers. I don't think we're going to convince the people whose first priority is the conservation of nature that hydroelectric power is a good thing to do. But from my perspective, Chris, I have the African heads of state every year, every 6 months really, coming to me and saying, what are you doing? How do you expect us to fight Ebola, grow our economies, create jobs, provide education, and allow students to study at night because they have light? How do you expect us to do that if we're living under this situation of what we've called energy apartheid?
Let's talk a little bit about renewables like solar, particularly in these places. There's a group called Solar Electric Light Foundation, or Solar Electric Light Fund, that I've spent some time reporting on. They've actually partnered with Partners in Health, where you used to be, doing distributed solar in places like Haiti. How scalable is that? How much is going on in the space of distributed solar in very poor and or remote parts of the world?
I've been very impressed. First of all, the price of PV, the photovoltaics, has gone down tremendously, and it's reached what's called grid parity. In other words, the cost has gone down so that it's not more expensive than getting electricity off the grid. So I have seen it work extremely well. We've supported a company in India, and they've been able to deliver through solar-powered mini and microgrids energy for about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And at 15 cents a kilowatt hour, this company is making money. Moreover, they're using technology from First Solar in Ohio in the United States. So American technology that's shipped over to India. An Indian company then packages it in a way that provides these micro and mini grids in Indian villages at 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and they're making money. So, not only is it possible to do by organizations like Partners in Health, but you can make money out of it. So I think we're just getting to the point now where it's a very reasonable proposition that many of these villages can be supplied in this way. But let me make another point. Right now, there's still, solar and wind is still intermittent power. It's not the kind of steady base load that you need to develop an industry. You cannot tell countries in Africa, for example, the poorest countries in the world, that while the rich countries are burning coal, while the rich countries are using every means possible, including hydro, you folks are going to have to deal with just intermittent power. Right. There is never a country in the world that's developed with just intermittent power. So we have to do both things. We have to really scale up access to solar micro and mini grids. This is a great area of work, but we also have to make sure that the base load's there.
Well, you now run what is a financial institution. It's a bank. It's called the World Bank. And there's a lot of interesting things happening around financial investment, particularly around the idea of what's called stranded assets. Stranded assets is a term for all of the fossil fuel, the known and proven reserves that is on the books of either national oil companies or private publicly traded companies that can't be burned if we're going to essentially stay under a catastrophic level or a risk of catastrophe. How real do you think that is in the minds of investors? How real do you see that in your role as running such a large financial institution?
Well, they're not stranded yet, because if you look at the company valuations, the assets that they have in the ground are still being considered as part of the value of the particular company. Here's my view on this. I think the science is absolutely clear that we've got to keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. There's no question about that. Now, there are lots and lots of different ways to get there. We've actually been working with some petroleum companies thinking about ways of getting to the 2 degrees Celsius, or keeping us underneath that level. So I think that there are a lot of different things happening right now that could shift the curve in a positive way. And so the positive things that are happening, Chris, I think are the following. One, I think there's a much clearer understanding of the role of a price on carbon. We'll be talking a lot about it at the Climate Summit in New York City. We have been very surprised at the number of corporations and countries that are ready now to really put a price on carbon on the table, maybe as soon as in the next year and a half or so. That's what we've really got to focus on, price on carbon. The other thing we have to do in a very positive way the cost of subsidies on fossil fuels, sometimes in some of the poorest countries, Egypt has extremely high fossil fuel subsidies, so the price of gasoline is almost nothing. The cost to governments of fossil fuel subsidies is so much higher, so many times higher than what they invest in subsidies for renewable energy. If we can shift those subsidies from fossil fuels to renewable energy, for example, we can make a huge, huge impact. The market will determine what happens and whether it decides that these in fact are stranded assets or not. Another positive thing, though, that I'm seeing is the explosion in interest in green bonds. A few years ago, these were just very small and scattered. But we set a target back in Davos this winter to reach $20 billion in green bonds. And I'll make an announcement of where we are, but let me just tell you now, extremely encouraging, the level of interest in those green bonds.
You just mentioned the climate summit that's going to be happening in New York next week. I imagine you'll be attending that. What are you hoping to see come out of that?
Well, I've been working very closely with the Secretary General of the United Nations on this summit. And let me just tell you a few things that make me very optimistic. First, there are now over 125 heads of state that are going to be attending the summit. So this is really significant in and of itself. And every one of these heads of state are coming to make announcements, things that they're doing, things that they're committed to doing in the future. And I think it's going to be a very nice staging ground to prepare us for the Committee of the Parties, the COP21 in Paris in about a year and a half, in which we'll be trying to put together a treaty. I think some of the things that are come out of it, one, I think that we will be making an announcement about carbon pricing, about the number of countries and companies coming together on carbon pricing. I think there's going to be agreement on the preservation of forests, which is very, very important. We're going to make an announcement on just how quickly the green bond market has been growing. And with the involvement of former Mayor Bloomberg and people like Bill Clinton and mayors from around the world, I think we're going to be able to put on the table a very aggressive effort at building cleaner, more sustainable cities, more livable cities. So there will be lots of, we don't quite know what the countries are going to be bringing to the table, but in little bits and pieces that I've heard, I think it's going to be significant dollars in commitment. I think there's going to be a tremendous level of ambition in terms of reducing carbon intensity. And together, having all the 125 heads of state sitting together, just feeling that this is a project that we've got to take on together, that in and of itself will be important.
You just mentioned livable cities as part of that, sustainable and livable cities as part of that agenda. And it seems, one of the greatest human migrations in history has taken place just in China of people moving from the countryside to cities. We're seeing that trend of mass urbanization happening across the developing world. And those cities are now going to be the centers for what the kind of emissions profile looks like. How central are cities and urbanization to getting to where we need to be?
Well, they account for about 70% of all carbon emissions, so cities are going to be critical. It was a great experience for us. The first time I met the Premier Li Keqiang in China, he had been so encouraged by his work with my predecessor, Bob Zoellick, and the fantastic work that Bob and the team did in putting together a report on China's economic reform, the so-called China 2030 report, that he asked me to undertake the next report, which would be on urbanization. So we literally brought more than 100 of our own specialists together with hundreds of Chinese specialists and put together a report that really describes how they're going to build these cleaner, more livable cities. Something happened last year in 2013. The winter of 2013 was so bad in China in terms of pollution that it really set off alarm bells. And I remember meeting with leading Chinese officials in the G20 meeting in Moscow in February of 2013. And they told me about, and have since announced, an incredibly aggressive strategy for reducing their carbon intensity. And so, we looked at everything from, systems of how you provide health and education services to people who are coming from the rural areas, to building the cleanest, most livable cities. There are parts of Shanghai that have just gone way over, LEED Platinum in terms of their buildings.
Yep.
I visited areas where they have so sort of climate-proofed their buildings that they're really on the cutting, leading edge of energy efficiency, for example. This is a big issue, Chris, energy efficiency. So any of you who've been to Moscow in the winter know that there are big, airy buildings that lose a lot of heat. We estimate that Russia loses every year through inefficient buildings enough energy to provide all the energy needs of France. So,
Wow.
part of building cleaner, more livable cities is public transport, of course, use of waterways, providing services. All those things are important. But building buildings that are energy efficient is hugely important. One of the great things is just being more efficient with our use of energy, whether it's hybrid cars, electric cars, or more efficient buildings, can account for 25% of the reductions we need to get to keep at the 2 degrees Celsius level.
Dr. Jim Kim, President of the World Bank, great pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Chris.